The year is 1995, and skateboarders from around the world are convinced that the X Games will be the new Olympics. It was the year when Brad Pitt opened the wrong box, MTV's Road Rules gassed up for the first time, and Coolio topped the charts with his hit single, Gangsta's Paradise. But we're not here to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, take a look at my life, and realize there's nothing left, because today we're counting down Electronic Gaming Monthly's worst reviewed games of 1995. Fool! No, VR Troopers is not the sarcastic name you give your grandparents when they try virtual reality for the first time. It was actually a TV show back in the 1990s that cynically assumed that a Mighty Morphin Power Rangers ripoff with a virtual reality component would be a big hit. It was every bit as derivative as it sounds, so it probably won't surprise you that the VR Troopers video game made by Sega is yet another Me Too brawler that brings nothing new to the table. Or as Mike puts it, another example of a cheesy fighting game with absolutely terrible sound, grainy 16-color graphics, and horrible controls. Resident Fake Ninja Sushi X had no love for this licensed atrocity. This title is an example of how the popularity of fighting games can also hurt the quality of new releases by lowering the standards of game mechanics just to make a fast sale. He's sadly right, and that's a problem we saw a lot of in the mid-1990s. For what it's worth, Andrew thought VR Troopers was bad, but not that bad. He gave it a 5 out of 10 and said the moves were hard to pull off, explaining that it was only remedied by the fact that you could defeat most opponents with repeated low kicks. With his 5 and Mark's 4, VR Troopers averaged out to a terrible 3.75 out of 10. It's hard to believe that there was a time when TV networks assumed that American kids wouldn't be into Japanese anime, but that was the reality for those of us that grew up in the 1980s and 90s. Instead of getting the real thing, we got Americanized ripoffs like Exo Squad. And while I'm sure that this short-lived Robotech knockoff still has its fans, I think we can all agree that the Genesis game made by Novo Trade is garbage. No, starts Al Manuel. I wasn't pleased with this game at all. Sushi X agreed, calling it frustrating to play and simply not enjoyable. He adds that there are tons of mandatory hits where you don't feel like you're in total control. On the bright side, everybody seemed to like the cinema that kicks the game off. Unfortunately, they hated everything else. Exo Squad comes in with an average of 3.75 out of 10. As somebody with a reputation for being a Jaguar apologist, even I can't defend Aircars. When people mock Atari for their dumb do the math campaign, I get it. If the idea was to convince everybody that 64-bit gaming was the wave of the future, they probably should have added a few more textures to those flat polygons. But instead of waiting until the game was good, or even playable, Midnight Entertainment rushed Aircars to the market and suffered the consequences. What is this? Asks Al. Somebody please tell me this isn't a Jaguar game. It is, and it's a bad one. Daniel Carpenter echoed that opinion, saying that in the age where visuals can help a bad game out, Aircars doesn't even have this crutch. And then there's Sushi X, who may have liked the multiplayer link-up feature, but ultimately concluded that he just isn't that into flight sims. Wait, is Aircars a flight sim? When you're floating a foot above the ground, is that really considered flying? That's like calling this a hoverboard. Either way, Aircars earned a pitiful average of 3.5 out of 10. ...1995 was the year that Absolute Entertainment decided to shut down for good. If this horrendous 3DO port of Rise the Robots is any indication, then maybe that was a smart decision. Don't get me wrong, this terrible fighting game was bad on every console, but it was especially difficult using the 3DO's awful gamepad. Ed Simrad wasn't alone when he said that this is by far the worst fighting game I've ever seen. Al literally started his review by pulling his hair out of his head in disgust and asking, "What in the world is this supposed to be?" Don't look to fighting game expert Sushi X for answers, because he spends most of his review talking about the cinemas. Well, I have to admit that the cinemas are done well. They sure are lengthy and quite abundant in this fighting game, yet I don't think it really needs that many. It seems too much time and resources went into good cinemas, but it's overdone way too much. Yeah, anything to not talk about the awful fight mechanics, I guess. Rise of the Robots averages a horrible 3.5 out of 10. Hey, remember a few minutes ago when I said that I was a bit of a Jaguar apologist? Well, that doesn't extend to Atari's ill-fated Jaguar Cd. This terrible add-on started bad and never got better. Blue Lightning CD wasn't simply a terrible pack-in game, but ended up being the worst reviewed game of the year. And I'm not just talking about 1995, but most years. With an average of 2.25 out of 10, this is the lowest score we've seen from Electronic Gaming Monthly since it launched in 1989. Mark perfectly sums up everybody's frustration. If the Jag CD's job is to improve the quality of the next generation of games that'll be released on this new unit, then there is definitely a problem here. Yeah, the problem is the Blue Lightning CD isn't as awesome as the 1989 Lynx game. And you better believe that every critic had to point this out. The Lynx version offered a great game that was fun to play, while the Jag version made me long for the handheld release of old. And it wasn't just that it was a bad reboot, but also a terrible console game. As Andrew points out, Blue Lightning looks like it plays like a bad Commodore 64 game. Harsh, but accurate. Hey, thanks for watching us count down EGM's worst reviewed games of 1995. So here's the question I have for you. What was your least favorite game of 1995? And remember, it doesn't have to be one of the ones we listed here. 1995 also brought us The Used, Stargate, Virtuoso, that game based on Dragon the Bruce Lee story, Corpse Killer, and even a full-motion Power Rangers game. How did that not come up when we were talking about VR Troopers? Anyway, let me hear your thoughts in the comments below. We'll be back soon with a look at Electronic Gaming Monthly's best reviewed games of 1996, but in the meantime, I recommend you click the subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.